So I wanted to talk about uh, an interest. Well, I think it's an interesting topic as far as the seeking goes, and um, it ties in with the more extreme, you could say, or esoteric, um, top-down teachings that point to the primacy of awareness. That really awareness is all there is, and that the whole universe is arising in awareness, and that awareness in this context is being referred to as an impersonal awareness, the awareness of God, Brahman, all there is. And Nisargadatta Maharaj refers to awareness as the ultimate, essentially, and even his use of the word consciousness in certain periods of his teaching. Consciousness is used to describe something that is sort of a lower order, or on it's an expression of awareness. And so awareness is often referred to as the absolute or the ultimate, and that there is nothing beyond awareness. And there's very good reason for that. And the good reason is that from a relative perspective, what is being said can be seen to be accurate. Now that can seem a bit strange. From a relative perspective, what is being said can be seen to be accurate, given that what they're talking about is awareness as the absolute, which really means that it's not a relative perspective. It is absolute and can be known as the absolute. And how can it be known as the absolute? By default, that means that it isn't being known by something outside of it, by something separate from it. Because if it was known by something separate from it, it means it's being perceived. And if it's being perceived, then there is a general acknowledgement or consensus that to perceive something means for it to be outside of you. That means you can only have a relative view of it. You can only see it through, let's say, instruments, in the case of the human being, senses, and then that information is going to be processed by a relative instrument, the brain. And so anything that is known from a distance, anything that is known from outside of it, means it is perceived, and means that what we can see, what we can know of it, what we can understand of it, is not the thing itself, but rather a perspective of it, an interpretation of it, a perspective of it. And it has to be relative, which means not absolute. It has to be relative, I guess, means from a certain perspective, from a certain standpoint. And a good example of this is when someone uses a cylinder as the example and shows that when you look at the cylinder from one perspective, the front-on view is it's a rectangle. When you look at the cylinder from a top-down view, it's a circle. And they're both relatively accurate and true. That is the view, that is the object from that perspective. And so you can see an object from two perspectives, and see a rectangle from one perspective and a circle from the top view perspective of a cylinder. And they're different. They seem like contradictions. They seem like, well, this can't be the same thing because they are different. Until we grasp that they are aspects or facets of the whole. And so as a relative view, they are accurate. And if you can put all of the views together, you get the whole. But because there are infinite perspectives, infinite positions from which you can stand and see something, there are going to be infinite perspectives, which means we can't really put them all together and know the whole. However, we can get a good idea of the whole by stitching perspectives together. More than one perspective helps flesh out the whole, understanding that we can't really ever know the whole from outside, from perceiving. We can only have an image of it. And so in the teachings of the non-dual awakening perspective, what I'm describing as the best we can know is a perspective, a relative view, is what is being challenged. And the encouragement is for us to know things truly, to know things as they really are, to drop out of the perspective of seeing things from a relative and to bump into the truth, to know ourselves truly. And so to pursue this, we have to understand that the teachings will tell us, we have forgotten who we are, that the seeking process is a process of self-discovery, of rediscovery, of self-realization. And the self that is being spoken about is a self that is not the self, the personal, relative, human self. In fact, what we're told is that personal human self and knowing ourselves as that means that we are limited to seeing life from outside. We are limited to knowing life on a relative level. We're limited to knowing life through thinking. And that is the problem. That is what creates the separation. And to know ourself truly is to know ourself as the ultimate. To know ourself as all that there really is. To know ourself as God, because in the description, God is all there is, and God is expressing itself in this world of form. But the essence of the world of form, the background of the experience of the world of form, is none other than the God that is all there is, that is what we are. Now, to a seeker who is seeking because there is an uncomfortableness with life. There is a longing, a yearning for peace, a yearning for something different to how life has been known. This is very appealing. This is very good news. And it's one of the hallmarks of the seeking process to come across this information. It's grace for us to come across this information because it inspires us, it ignites a fire. And for those seekers that are lucky enough, I guess, for those pointers to start resonating, and for the words that are really words designed to take us away from thinking, words that are going to encourage us to move to a position of being one with life, being that awareness that is described as the background, the essence, the nature of life, the building blocks of life. And so for those seekers that find themselves resonating and change happening because of those pointers, then that's grace, that's a godsend, that's beautiful. And so in talking about these methodologies, my purpose is to put words around them so that some seekers who have been in that process, this satsang is not for those seekers that don't resonate with that process and are hearing it as, oh yes, you see, I don't resonate with that process because it's not true. That's not what this satsang is about. It's very easy to hear that in the descriptions sometimes, because I will say that, what they say is a methodology, is not the truth. Any satsang, any teaching, including the teachings of non-doership and non-attachment, are the same. They are concepts, they are pointers, and they are not ultimately the truth. And I feel very much that the role that the non-dual teachings play is one that very few other methodologies or practices or activities in our daily life play. So I'll repeat that the role that the non-dual, top-down, esoteric teachings that say that what we are is not the body, what we are is not a human, what we are is awareness in which the whole universe arises, play a very important role, because they work on our perception of life. They work on our thinking process of life to the in a way and to a depth and at a level that is not something that is a conscious change, but rather a change on a structural level of how life is perceived. And what happens when there is a structural change in the way that our brain processes information, in the way that our brain relates to the objects that arise as part of the modulated experience of life, as there's a structural change and our brain then processes information differently, the experience changes. And the experience and the structural change are extremely important in order for a spaciousness, a dimension, a placeless place, to open up in the human being that can result in what is often referred to as a resting in being. And a resting in being means a capacity to be in life for extended periods of time, and extended period of time could mean 5 or 10 seconds, as well as 5 or 10 minutes or 2 or 3 hours or even longer. Why 5 or 10 seconds? Because often we've spent years without spending a second in this space of being where thinking is not present, and if it is present, it is seen as a movement of thought, an object. And in this space of being, what there is a connection with, and remember, these are just words, so connection, if someone was technical, looked at the word technically, they'd say, oh, there's a connection, so who is connecting to what? And when I say there is a connection, there is a revealing in this space, in this place, or a being, a component or an aspect, aspect, let's say an aspect of the human being that can be overlooked, can be parked away and not accessed for our whole life. And the tragedy of that is that aspect of the human being is what can be called home. And the reason it's called home is because when we move to there and rest there, it feels like the struggle has stopped. It feels like the being away from home and feeling away from home and feeling like I yearn to get back home. That falls away. And so all these words that are used are words that have made sense to use as descriptions for the experience that is known by various masters, teachers that have found these changes happening for themselves in their life. A teaching is most effective, and a teacher, I would go as far as to say, is only really effective if what they're talking about is their own experience that they are then investigating for themselves, really trying to understand what that is. So looking at the experience in detail. So what that means is that, for example, peace. Peace can seem like a feeling, especially if it comes in after there is suffering, because of the contrast between the suffering and then when the suffering stops, there's peace, and it's like, and you could even say, this is bliss. And so that might be the original way it's described, as someone starts finding themselves moving into peace from suffering. It's like, this is bliss. And as they're describing it, depending on the personality of the person as well, then they might go in and say, now, how do I best communicate this? not for the sake of communicating it, because communicating it is part of their own self-contentment or self-fulfillment, because in fact the shift, the change, the transformation delivers the self-contentment, delivers the self-fulfillment. So it's no longer talking about it in order to feel defined by other people appreciating you or loving you for what has happened, or for what your experience of life is, but rather it's a communication to help, to aid, to contribute to further change of the same sort, just like teachings and teachers that had done the same for us while we were seeking. It then is known that, well, there is something here that can be offered. And I think that if we go in and really look at the experience and say, how do I describe this most efficiently, most effectively? And so we might then look at peace, what peace of mind is, and really see as, and it takes more and more experience. So the more and more experience we have, the more and more familiar we are with something, the more we get to see the nuances of it. And also there is a development and a continual change, or at least it's, when I say continual, there are some very significant changes while things are settling in. And I wouldn't argue with the fact that, or with the suggestion that there is always going to be change. So at the beginning, as things settle in, and especially as we develop a concept around what has actually happened and what is happening, what the process is, then there is more and more more and more significant change. So as someone looks at it more and more, their concepts, their descriptions will change. And so what used to be referred to as a feeling of bliss or love might then start to be seen as, actually, it's peace. And when the shift from suffering to peace isn't happening, and rather there is just ongoing peace, then the contrast sense falls away. And that's where it starts to become more readily seen as the absence of suffering, rather than the introduction of a feeling of peace. Whereas when the contrast of shifting out of suffering into peace is there, it feels much more like something. And the same can be said with a lot of other components of the seeking. We might have certain peak experiences. We might have waves of love come through. There's the Sanskrit word agape for the unconditional, non-objective love that can bubble up, and it seems very much linked to our essence, or the formless aspect of what we are. And so that can come through, and when it comes through, it's got a very profound feeling and sense to it. And so we might, and it may happen consistently or regularly, and so we might then assume, oh, that's it, and miss the fact that it happens regularly, but we can't say that it is unchanging. And when we start to realize, oh, that's unchanging, that is changing, and maybe there is something else that is unchanging, and that the changing, like the feelings of love and joy, might be bonuses. They might be part of the pleasure and pain spectrum, and maybe much more linked to a connection to oneself rather than a circumstantial pleasure or pain. But we might then stop describing that as liberation, and rather focus on the lowest common denominator, that which comes and doesn't change, instead of focusing on the more, let's say, what you could call impressive, because they are something, they are a feeling, but they come and go. And in fact, we might then change our view about what impressive is and realize that that which is more subtle, that which is less of a thing but actually a great gift, the peace of mind that can be consistent and unchanging, that is impressive. And then we might see, that is actually the gift, that while my attention, even as a teacher could be focusing on bliss or feelings of love, because they have happened much more than they used to happen. They might be doing practices that have them come in to their experience of life regularly. And if you ask them whether that was unchanging, whether that was always their experience, is it their experience when someone that they love passes away? Is it their experience when something mundane in the flow of life is painful, is not as it should be? Is there always this overflowing feeling of love and bliss? Or is that something that happens regularly through the day, maybe, but when circumstance supports it? And so as we start to become more familiar with this and these nuances, then what we say starts to change. So I think I've gone off onto a little side path. We'll come back to the topic of today, is talking about the non-dual teachings and what they put forward and why it's so important. So what that set of pointers does is it suggests that the world is radically different to the interpretation of the world that we currently have. And when we look at it, the suggestion of the difference is that the world is not real, that objects are not real, that causality is not real, that time and space are not real, that separation is not real, that there is no separation, and that we are not the body. That what we are is formless awareness in which the whole appearance of life happens. And I have no argument with any of those statements on two fronts. One, as very effective teaching methodology that can rewire our perception of life in such a way that can be very useful to then allow a refining of the rewiring, which means more rewiring, in a way that can lead to continuous unbroken peace of mind. And note, I did talk about a secondary rewiring after the first rewiring, because if the secondary rewiring doesn't happen, my suggestion is that the primary rewiring leaves us with a set of new beliefs, new spiritual beliefs that actually change our experience. It does create sort of a permanent oneness style or oneness seeing of life. But that's not liberation. That's not enlightenment, according to this teaching framework. What that is a rewiring, a change that can become a very important part of the setting in of peace of mind. However, if the secondary rewiring, refining, doesn't happen, then what happens is we find ourselves seeing life from this new perspective that is a sort of what I would say a halfway house of seeing life. And I'd have to say that the perspective from that position is often quite deluded. What is believed to be known turns out to be a delusion about life and who we are and what we are, and it becomes it becomes known as a delusion once it gets further refined. And the irony is that before it gets further refined, the shift that has happened appears to be a shift from the relative to the absolute. And because that shift is a shift that demonstrates and feels like and seems to confirm a shift from relative perception to absolute knowing, then the conviction of the seeker in which that change has happened is sometimes immutable. And in fact, the only course of action, once enough effort has been made to show where things are not being seen clearly, where there is a delusion, once enough effort has been made, it becomes very clear that the new belief structure is so it's sort of the perfect storm, aided by the fact that the shift that actually has happened, the change in the way life is perceived, and it still is perception, but to the person, to the experience, within the experience itself, it seems like it is no longer perception, and that it is now freedom from perception, that it is the absolute view of life. And so that perfect storm means that as a teacher, your best course of action is to step back and allow time, allow the process to be what brings about the further change. Because frankly, it is at the wrong time. It's like trying to lift a mountain. And so it's known it's not going to happen just yet. So let time do its job. And so I think that's why these satsangs, occasionally I'll put them out, are very important. Some of the feedback that I receive that is most powerful is from seekers that have been seeking on the non-dual path for 15, 20, 30 years, sometimes even more. And they write about how this set of pointers is what was needed to propel them out of a sort of spiritual cul-de-sac where they were going round and round trying to get deeper and deeper into the nothing, missing the fact that actually what really inspires seeking originally is a yearning for the end of suffering. And because the non-dual teachings that I have so much respect for, and I really believe they need to be there, I don't spend a lot of time putting forward those pointers because I am thankful that a lot of other teachers appreciate how important that is because of the structural change that repeatedly hearing a description of life that is radically different to how we currently perceive life, how important that is. And so I know that that's out there and people are going to be exposed to it, and it's going to resonate with people, and they're going to be on that path, and they're going to change, and they're going to have awakenings, and that is exactly what needs to happen to move us down the process. And then some people who have had that happen and have found a stagnation listen to a satsang like this one, resonate with what is said. Some things are put into a different perspective. So the focus is no longer about knowing oneself as formless awareness, which is something that can happen. But what happens there is actually not knowing oneself as formless awareness. It's awakening to an aspect of the experience that has always been there, an aspect of the experience that the experience is dependent on. So it's primary to experience, and it's an aspect that we're not normally grounded in. In fact, we're grounded usually very much in the experience rather than on the outer edge of the experience. So that shift is a radical shift in what you would say at that point in time is a shift of identity, a shift from identifying with the body, identifying with thoughts, identifying with emotions, to finding oneself located, positioned outside of that ground, that centeredness in the human being, and witnessing the experience of life that has previously been perceived from a very relative point of view, relative to the body, relative to the person, and now see life from a perspective where it's known to be an impersonal unfolding, an impersonal arising, and it's known relative to impersonal witness or an impersonal subject. And what I mean by impersonal is that field of awareness that can become aware of itself. When that happens, there is a sense that what I am, this is where it gets confusing. There is a person, Roger, speaking and using the word I, and so in that awakening, there is the sense what I am, but the I is referring to no longer the person that we have known ourselves as. But what I am is this formless, impersonal awareness that has no age, has no gender, has no preferences, and is intimate and one with the whole experience, which really means that none of the experience is happening outside of the awareness that is aware of it. And furthermore, not only is the awareness aware of it from no distance, but the experience, the image, the modulation itself is made of the awareness that is aware of it. So it is known, and what I mean by known is it is an experiential sense of being something radically different to what we have sensed ourselves as previously. And it is an experiential sense and knowing of the immediacy, the oneness, the intimacy of all of life as being not separate from what we are. Now, doesn't that sound impressive? It sounds like that's what it's all about. That is what the seeking is about. And to some extent, it is, because seeking is a process. Seeking is a process of change. It is, you could say, a process of evolution within a human lifespan. Just like we evolve in terms of our capacity to think and speak, in terms of our capacity to carry out certain jobs with increasing proficiency as there is more experience in doing certain work. Once a seeker starts to investigate, starts to contemplate, there is a process of evolution, of change. And all of these changes along the way are important. They build on each other. They become the foundation for further insight. Now, the teachings that have the effect of changing one's perspective of life, including one's sense of self, repeatedly, because that's how change happens, when we are repeatedly exposed to something that becomes part of our information base, and not necessarily information in the part of our brain that's like a filing cabinet that we can go and access whenever we want, but rather a change on the informational level that actually changes the structure of our sense of our perception faculty. So those teachings keep describing life in a way that creates a shift, allows us to see a wholeness, a oneness in whatever is happening, dissolves the mind's separating habit. And the separating habit of the mind has come in primarily for two reasons. One, because of the way that our intellect develops, especially in relation to language. And secondly, based on how the world is experienced through the various senses, including the sense of touch, the sense of sight, and the sense of sound, where the many objects within the singular experience of life. And so that is one of the paradoxes, is many objects within the singular experience of life. So you could look at that. What I mean by a paradox is it seems like it's a contradiction. So someone could jump on it and say, well, how can there be many objects in a singularity? And a paradox is where it is that, and we need to come to see it in a way where seemingly contradictions can be held as complementary, meaning you put them together and it allows us to see the whole in a way that is closer to how it really is, let's say. So one of the ways of reconciling this seeming paradox of the many objects within the singular arising of the life experience is to look at it as if you are looking at a painting. A painting is a singular painting. However, within that singular painting, there may be many different flowers and birds and seemingly separate objects. And yet they are all part of the one painting. And so what makes them seemingly separate objects is the distinction that is included within the experience. And in this case, the experience is, in the metaphor, is the painting. And so the painting has distinctions in it, different colors, different textures. And so where the red and the yellow meet, there is a boundary formed. And that boundary creates a quasi-separation where there really is no separation. There is the red and the yellow, which are not two, and yet they are two. So the yin-yang symbol is a representation of this. There is the duality of the interconnected black and white, and yet when you look at it closely, the duality forms the singular object, and that is the paradox. And so life is a non-dual duality, where from one perspective we can see it as a non-duality. There is not two. And then when you go in to the detail, you see that the content of the non-dual experience is always duality. Health and disease, wealth and poverty, good and bad, pleasure and pain, male and female. And to ignore the duality and just see the oneness is to miss one aspect of the paradox, and to ignore the oneness and just see the duality is to miss an aspect of the paradox. And so what our perception, as we've developed over time, has tended to do is it has naturally focused on the distinction, the separation, the boundaries of objects that are emphasized based on our sense of the world. And furthermore, we then have vocabulary and thinking about all of these objects. So each object has a singular word that defines it from the next object. And on top of that, the experience of life is always going to be experience of, in practice, separation and duality. Although we can also shift to a place where we can see it as a whole, but to the extent that we stop acknowledging that on an experiential level, that if we don't force ourselves to remain looking from a singularity perspective, the book feels very different to the plant. And so the appreciation of the oneness doesn't take away the fact that life will continue to present on an experiential and a practical level as a duality. And we have to continue to live our life as a human being in a world of form, a world of, in practice, separation. And so because that's how we have to continue to live life, and we've always had to live life like that, this combination of factors that we have to live life and will continue to have to live life as if we are separate, as if it is a world of duality. And because our senses see things as separate, and because our thinking works on a thinking framework of language, which includes many individual separate words, what we have come to know is a world of separation. The oneness aspect has not been appreciated. And so our brain needs to be rewired. And I'm not saying that it needs to be rewired just in terms of concepts like information that we're told, do you understand that the book is vibrating molecules and the tree is vibrating molecules, and we understand that in theory, and so we can say, yes, I understand in theory that the world is actually a soup of vibrating molecules, that there is only energy. That's one form of conditioning that can inform us of the oneness of life. But that's not the conditioning and the rewiring that is needed to uproot the deeply ingrained self-identity that is based on knowing life as separation, knowing life as duality. So simply understanding the theory about the oneness is insufficient at rewiring on the level that is required. The teachings that come in and say, life is an illusion, life is an appearance in the mind of God, life is an arising within consciousness, are pointing at life as so fundamentally different. They're saying something much more radical than what you would hear in a science class that is saying, hey, do you realize that the book and the wood and the glass are all vibrating energy? And you can be shown some interesting slides that show that, or you could look under a quantum microscope and see the micro dimension where form dissolves. And so we can see that, and that's not going to shake us out of our existing paradigm. However, if life is continually described radically differently by a teaching that through grace we have a resonance with, we have a trust in, and because the teachings know what needs to be emphasized in order to actually bring about the rewiring on an experiential level where there is going to be a exclamation in the seeker's experience, an exclamation of that isn't an exclamation of words, but an exclamation of experiential knowing of life differently. And a lot of this has to do with the encouragement to not think about what is happening, to not think about what is seen, to recognize that the appearance of life, and what I mean by the appearance of life is what is appearing in this very moment. Your life only exists, only ever appears in the present moment. That what is appearing in this moment is appearing within a field of awareness, and that what is appearing is always changing, and that what is appearing doesn't require us to think about it, comment on it, judge it. That the appearance and the awareness of the appearance happens quite possibly, especially in the exploration, is suggested not through the eyes, not through the ears, but because of the very background of awareness that is its function is to be aware. And that, once again, the teachings will say that awareness doesn't require eyes to see and ears to hear. That correlation between the eyes and the ears, or the correlation between the eyes and the seeing, the ears and the hearing, the nose and the smelling, the tongue and the tasting, the hands and the touching, that correlation is part of the illusion, part of the trick of the experience of life. That life is an experience designed for us to forget ourselves, designed for life to be known as a duality, as a separation, which really means a forgetting of the truth. And then within that story, that experience of life, that illusion of life, the game of life, there may be an awakening, a remembering, a recognition of the oneness of life. And so the teachings will frame life this way in order for the notion that seeing is happening because of the eyes to fall away, in order for the belief that hearing is happening because of the ears to fall away. And it is very, very much available for us to know life in the silence, in the stillness, for us to know life in a way that presents itself as if it is known from a perspective that is not happening through the body. Where the concept that says the seeing is not happening through the eyes is seen to be accurate. The hearing is not happening through the ears is seen to be accurate. And in that shift, there is an immediacy to all of life. An immediacy because it is now being known not through the filter that it was previously known through. Now, I'm not saying it's no longer known through a filter. I'm just saying it's not known through the same filter that it was known through before. However, the new filter, if there is a new filter, is different to the old filter, and the experience therefore feels different. So much so that it feels like it's an experience that is not happening through a filter. It may just be that the new filter has less relative filtering than the old filter, and therefore the contrast seems like, and is, a contrast between more relativity, which was the past, to an experience that has less relativity, and on initial assessment that might be taken to be the end of relativity. So just an example of what I mean is that if a certain type of thinking, a narrative, a judgment of what is happening falls away, you might appreciate that a judgment of what is happening. So, for example, some trees being knocked down in order for a development, a road or a highway to happen. Someone might have the narrative about what a tragedy that is. And that is a narrative from their perspective. And so we can see that that thought is very much a relative assessment of what is. And someone else might look at it and appreciate that development is going to have very significant effects that may affect communities in beneficial ways. And I'm not suggesting which one is right. I'm just pointing out that you can have two very radically different thoughts about the one thing, which hopefully allows us to appreciate that that filter, that judgment of what is happening, whether it's good or bad, is relative. And so if that filter falls away, a relative filter falls away, then there is the circumstance happening, and it is witnessed without a judgment of it being good or bad. And the experience is an experience of less relativity. What may be described or felt as intimacy with the experience, because the layer of separation has fallen away. So now there is a capacity to be with what is, because a layer of judgment is not obscuring what is not changing what is into what I know it as or what I think it as, whether it's on this side or that side of the spectrum of appreciating it or not appreciating it. And so that silence can be called the absence of the relative. And there's a great freedom in that, because the suffering, the uncomfortableness with oneself is contained in that layer of relative thinking. And so when we find ourselves conditioned in such a way that interferes with our habit of finding fault with what is, because we haven't been reminded, we haven't been shown that life is a singularity, life is appearing, and that our narrative is a resistance to what is, and it doesn't actually change what is. And so as more and more of these pointers are pointed out and this becomes sensed and seen, then the habit of resisting life, of arguing with life, even when life is delivering situations that are not our preference, so painful, there can be a understanding of when it is futile to resist the pain, and an understanding of when it makes sense to do something practically in order to bring about potentially an improvement in the situation. So very often we are resisting on a level of the psychological mind that is not going to bring any circumstantial change. And yet, for some reason, the identity that has been put in place, the psychological identity, feels like that is beneficial. And at some point it gets seen that that is actually just suffering, and that it makes no sense other than if we would like our peace of mind to be disturbed. And if that's our objective, then we should carry on. And even when I say we should carry on as if we have a choice, I'm suggesting that this happens as life reconditions us. And once we're reconditioned to see it makes no sense, then that functioning slows down and eventually can come to a stop. And this space outside of judgment, outside of narrative, is not a space that we have access to if our development just continues to follow the standard default course, because the standard default course about what life is and how we should act in life is one of essentially seeing life, judging it as to whether it's good or bad, and complaining, which really means resisting life. And so the normal standard sense of self that has been put in place is forced to never sit and just be. It's not an activity that is seen to empower or strengthen who we believe ourselves to be. And so if that's who we believe ourselves to be, we're sort of condemned to a life of involvement in what is. And involvement in what is really means it shouldn't be, it should be this instead of what it is. And that is, that gets extended to everything that the other does, everything that we do. And that essentially is non-acceptance. And so this shift is a shift into a place of freedom from that. So is that the absolute perspective? Is that knowing the absolute when we rest in the awareness aspect of the human being, which, mind you, is not how it is described. It's not described as the awareness aspect of the human being. It's described as the awareness of God. That is the source of all there is. Now, when we look at it more closely, what we find is that it's talking about the experience that is arising right here. And it's talking about awareness that is aware of this experience as the awareness of God. And it's emphasizing that the body is just another object of the experience that is known not by the body itself, because the body can't possibly know itself, but by the awareness that is primal to the experience. Now, is that true? Is it true that that perception of life, which is not described in those teachings as a perception, and so this is where it gets trickier. This is not a criticism. This is a development of the seeking process because if no one else was putting forward the non-dual perspective, I would need to do it. And I would do it because it's as essential as what I'm putting forward here. They all dovetail in with each other and support each other and take over where one left off. And sometimes one part, for some seekers, one teaching comes first and then another comes in afterwards. And for someone else, the teaching that came in after for the first seeker comes in first for the next seeker, and then vice versa. So it's not that one is better than the other, they're complementary. So, but it's important for me to point out, is it true that that awareness is the awareness of God? Is it true that that knowing life from a perspective that seems to be outside of the body, a perspective where the sense of self is a formless awareness that is all pervasive to the experience? Is it true that that is absolute and not relative? Is it true that knowing the experience of life as being interdependent on awareness, being essentially made of awareness, witnessed by awareness, arising in awareness, does that prove that there is nothing outside of awareness? When the shift happens, it becomes very clear, oh, everything is happening inside awareness. The thinking that I have previously felt as my thinking about an external world is thinking happening within a field of awareness. And this is part of the loosening of identification with thought, because it becomes very clear from that perspective that thinking can be anything. Thinking can tell us anything, can feel like anything. Thinking is then seen as a very relative movement. And once we see something as relative, meaning something comes and goes and it changes, then we realize, oh, I am not that in essence. I can't be that in essence. My essence is something much more consistent, much more unchanging, much more true than a thought that 1 minute says, oh, that person is fantastic. You know, I haven't met anyone. I've only met them for 2 days so far, but I've never met anyone so great. And then after the 4th day, it's like, oh, they're rubbish. So when we see that that is the nature of thought, or can be the nature of thought, we say, that can't be me. I can't be that transient, that changing, that untrue. And especially if those objects that come and go like that, so thoughts, emotions, attitudes and opinions to things, if they're seen relative to this screen, this dimension of the human being that is ever present, the waking life experience is dependent on it. Whether you're thinking the person is great or is rubbish, whether you're feeling excited or flat, awareness is here. And when there is a shift into that awareness, then we come into contact with something that we might call unchanging and absolute. And maybe it isn't absolutely absolute. I have no problem with saying it is much more unchanging than thought and emotion. It is much more ever present than thought and emotion and states and experiences. So, but the top-down non-dual teachings need to describe that as absolute, not as much more or much less relative, much less changing, much more present than the objects. They need to say it is the absolute. In order for attention to land on itself, or awareness to land on itself, in order for the thinking in the brain to change radically enough. Why do I say it's not absolute? Well, in deep sleep, the awareness falls away. Now, the teachings that I'm referring to here, because they understand what needs to happen, will even say in deep sleep awareness doesn't fall away. To make it absolute, in order for our brain to relate to it radically differently, because that's where we haven't seen life from. So essentially what is happening is a new platform is being laid, literally almost a platform in our brain. A new platform is being established onto which we shift and see life from, which really means a way that the brain processes what was previously known as the external world in such a way that it's now processing it and including in the experience the sense of awareness, which was always there. It just didn't get produced as a aspect of the experience. Now, in the awakening teachings, we're told that this is not got anything to do with a modulation of the mind, but rather this is a shift into that which is the absolute, that which was always the absolute, and that we had not known. And once again, that's said because it's powerful at bringing about the shift. When we really think about it and realize that these shifts happened because we listened to teachers, to teachings that suggested to see life differently. And if we start appreciating, that's new conditioning coming in that is received by a body-mind organism that has always received new conditioning and changed. We receive new conditioning in the form of human language, and we change in such a way that we can produce language, we can speak. And so we can then sometimes look back and laugh at the fact that we were so hypnotized by concepts that we came to believe certain descriptions of life. And so what I'm getting at is that you will have, as people awaken, an absolute conviction that the awakening, the shift, has nothing to do with the body-mind organism, that the shift is a shift out of the body-mind organism. And and I can completely understand why someone will insist on that, because when the shift happens, and when I'm talking about a shift, let's not get fixated about the shift, because the shift can happen in very many ways. And I'm talking about any shift, so any realization, any insight. When it happens and it seems like a flash that has not, it actually seems like it is outside of thought. And so we don't get to see the mechanics that have happened. We just have the output, the experience. And the experience can seem a certain way, which doesn't mean it is that way. It just, that's how it presents. The mechanics might be that it took a long time for things to be affected by the teachings in such a way that in a particular moment, which may even be when we weren't even thinking about it, something happened. And then we might say, oh, it had nothing to do with my thinking. In fact, it happened when I stopped, when I gave up. That's what the teachings have been telling us all along. Saying you're not going to be able to know awareness through thinking. If you keep trying to think about it, that thinking about what awareness is getting in the way of the seeing of awareness. And furthermore, they'll say you can't surrender. You can't do the surrendering. So even trying to not think about it is more doing, which is getting in the way of the immediacy of what is being spoken about. And so the teachings themselves will often say that how the surrendering happens is when we get so frustrated because of the process, the seeking, where we're forced to try and do it, and it doesn't work because the trying to think about awareness and understand what is meant by I am the formless awareness. And after months or years of this, at some point we go, I've had enough. I'm just going to get on with living. And this must be my lot in life. And we get on with it, and then a shift happens, and the person will say, it has nothing to do with thinking. I wasn't thinking about it. Ignoring the fact that there were 3 years of being exposed to teachings, practices, getting frustrated, all of that was part of the change. And so, imagine not seeing. If you weren't, let's say, the sense of sight wasn't there for all of humanity, or even for one person. And then suddenly you saw for the first time. It's going to seem pretty profound. It's like, what is this? Whereas it to us is normal. It's like, well, this is seeing. It's nothing. It's always been there. It's sight. So these shifts, these spiritual shifts, when they happen, seem like they are unexplainable. So if we talk about seeing, we can explain it based on dynamics, physics and causal dynamics, because seeing sight is something that we've understood. We've looked at how it happens, the processing in the brain, the light coming into the eyes, that information being processed and changed into electromagnetic signals, etc., etc. And so what we have is the end result, but we understand the dynamics by which that happens. So for the person that sees for the first time and hasn't heard about seeing, and let's say it's not something that's been investigated and observed and experimented on, and the dynamics are not known, I mean, it's just seeing, and it's like it just happened, and it has nothing to do with the body or the body or the mind. It just happens. And so spiritual experiences, spiritual insight is maybe a bit like that. It just happens for the first time, and it seems radical. It's unexplainable, and it seems to be completely disconnected from the body, just like if you suddenly started seeing, or you get a new sense. that you've never had before, like information coming into your head, you might say has nothing to do with the body. Maybe it has a lot to do with the body. We just haven't understood it, and how it appears to us is as if it has nothing to do with the body. And so, what am I going on about? I'm going on about the fact that, when the awakenings happening, when the shifts happen, there are a lot of statements about it that are statements made when an investigation of what is actually happening from a causal point of view is not has not happened. And there's an empathy with why that happens, because the shift is encouraged through a process of dropping a belief in causality in order to see everything as a happening, in order for us to see that the physical world doesn't really exist as a physical world, means that we need to untrain our brain from seeing everything causally. And in a particular moment, we might realize, oh, this is like a dream at night. It is an appearance in consciousness. And a dream at night happens not because of causality. So when the vase falls on the floor and breaks in your dream, there is no causality. There is a story of causality in the dream. So in the dream, someone knocks the vase over, and so that is the cause, and the effect is the vase hits the ground and breaks. So there's a story of causality, but we understand that ultimately the causality doesn't exist in the dream. It is all an appearance, and the laws of physics, the laws of time and space and causality are all the framework that has been established in order for that story to unfold that way within that established framework. And when the dream collapses, the whole framework collapses with it. And the teachings are trying to point to the fact that our experience of life is a modulation within consciousness. That what feels like a physical object is an experience of a physical object. An experience means a dream is an experience. So it is an experience of a modulation in consciousness that is designed to be experienced in such a way that it creates the experience of form. And so to see the background of experience, to appreciate experience as experience, the form needs to be highlighted as illusory. The causality needs to be highlighted as illusory. The time and the space need to be highlighted as illusory to bring our attention into the present moment. The memories of the past need to be highlighted as simply objects arising in the present moment that could be anything, and that they don't prove, just because there is an object that appears as a memory of the past doesn't prove that the past existed. So all of this is said to bring an appreciation of life as an experience. Now, another thing that gets perpetuated, which is wrong, is that when we see life as an experience arising in consciousness, that all there is the experience. We sometimes miss the fact that what it's saying is all that we have of life is an experience of life, and that our experience is always what is contained within, and there is nothing outside our experience, which doesn't mean there is nothing outside. It just means relative to our experience of life, the whole thing happens inside the field of awareness. Now, what that experience is an experience of is a question mark. It may be an experience of an external world that actually exists, or it may be an experience arising within a consciousness that is specifically created to arise this way and is not a reflection of an external world. And whether there's an external world or there isn't an external world is completely irrelevant. That's where we have to come, and yet the teachings will say there is nothing outside of awareness. The whole universe is dependent on awareness. What it's really saying is your whole experience of life is dependent on awareness, to bring us to appreciate that what we know as life is an experience. And why is that important? It's important because it allows us to rest in that dimension of beingness outside of thinking. The further refinement from these awakenings is to come and see and live life as if I live in a world of form, in a world of time and space, as a human being, as a person, which is how we have to continue to live life, how we always have lived life. The Buddha, Ramana, had to continue living life after liberation as if they were a human being in a world of form, in a world of time and space and causality. The awakening to the oneness, the awakening to the fact that we can experience life free of certain thinking. Awakening to the fact that knowing oneself as the doer and attached to outcomes can be seen as false, and so a whole layer of suffering can fall away forever, and we can live a life of freedom and a life of peace, a life of happiness, doesn't suddenly absolve us of living the dream of life or the game of life or just life in any way that is practically different. We can't walk through walls, we can't be in two places at once. And more to the point is we still have to attend to whatever circumstance our life destiny requires us to. And so Ramana continued to answer to his name and speak with devotees, continued to have to oversee the kitchen and look after the animals, and live as a human being in a world of form, turning on the kettle in order to get hot water, planning your life as if there is a future and finding that that is how life unfolds. Not being in control of the outcomes. So that becomes part of our attitude, is we say there is a future. I have to live as if there is a future. I need to make plans for certain things, to go to the doctor or to travel overseas, to meet up with friends. So we make plans. They're not always going to turn out as we would like, but I live as if there is a past, a future. And I live as if there was a past. You know, I see someone, I say, "Oh, hi, Peter. It's been 3 years since we saw each other at school." So we continue to function as if there was a past and as if there will be a future. However, we relate to the past and future very differently attitudinally, where there is no longer a regret and resentment over what happened in the past because it's understood that that was destiny unfolding. And similarly, there's no attachment to how the future will unfold because we know we're not in control of that. Not in control of the amount of pleasure and pain we will receive. And that's not such a big deal because we maybe are connected to the part of ourself that is already fulfilled and complete regardless of circumstance, regardless of what pleasure or pain present themselves. And that's the real gift. So does awakening to the fact that what life is from one perspective an arising in consciousness, and from another perspective we have to live it as if it is an objective reality. Does that prove that there is no external world? No, it doesn't. Does it prove that there is an external world? No, it doesn't. But we have to live as if our experience of life is an experience of an external world. And that to me is the integrated understanding after the realization. And there are teachers out there still who haven't seen past some of these concepts, and they have become beliefs, and that makes them better teachers in some regard, because it enables them to put forward that teaching with a conviction.